In the scorching August. Drip 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 dash. The shrill chirping of cicadas mixed with the intermittent sound of horns echoed on the bustling street. The blazing sun baked the gray-brown asphalt, causing heat waves to ripple, as if the entire street was distorting. Under the sparse shade of trees by the roadside, a few young men were huddled together, smoking cigarettes while waiting for the traffic light. Suddenly, a young man who was puffing smoke seemed to have noticed something. He made a soft noise of surprise, his gaze falling on a certain corner of the street. "Ano, what are you looking at?" his companion asked. The young man named Ano stared blankly at the corner of the street, and it took him a while to respond. "How do you think a blind man crosses the road? Do you think you're funny?" His companion rolled his eyes and followed Ano's gaze. The next moment, he was stunned. The companion hesitated for a moment before slowly saying, "Usually, blind people have someone to look after them when they go out, or they have guide dogs. In more modern cities, there are also voice broadcasts for traffic lights. If none of these are available, perhaps they could rely on the sound and their white cane to move bit by bit." Ano shook his head. What if there is no one to look after them, no guide dogs, no voice broadcasts, and even the white cane is used to carry peanut oil? Wrapped in black satin, the cane on the shoulder, vegetables in the left hand, oil in the right. This absurd scene attracted the attention of many people around. Across the street, a young man dressed in a black short-sleeved shirt stood. Several layers of thick black satin were wrapped around his eyes, blocking all light. His left hand held a cheap shopping bag full of vegetables, and his right hand held a white cane that was on his shoulder as if it were a pole. At the end of the cane, a large bucket of golden peanut oil was shining in the sun. Didn't you notice the white cane in his hand? He's obviously blind. In this day and age, most blind people wear sunglasses. Who still uses black satin to cover their eyes in this hot weather? Aren't they afraid of heatstroke? Hey, look, that person is really strange. Can he see the road with so much cloth covering his eyes? The summer cicadas chirping couldn't cover up the whispers of the passers-by. They curiously looked at the young man, discussing in low voices whether he was really blind or pretending to be, and at the same time, they looked expectantly at the flashing red light. Exactly, and have you ever seen a blind person who doesn't use a white cane to walk, but instead uses it to carry things? Young people these days sure know how to have fun. It was a little girl in a school uniform, about 12 or 13 years old. Her cheeks were dotted with a few drops of sweat, and her big black eyes were worriedly looking at the young man, pure and simple. The young man was slightly taken aback and turned his head to look at the little girl, a smile appearing at the corner of his mouth. Just then, a crisp voice sounded from beside the young man. "Brother, let me help you cross the road." Click dash. The green light came on. Okay. He hung the bag of vegetables on his right hand, freeing his left hand to wipe the sweat on his clothes, then gently held the little girl's hand. As for the young man, he walked steadily. In the eyes of everyone, this scene didn't look like a kind-hearted girl leading a blind man across the road, but rather like a big brother leading a child across the road. The young man took a step forward and walked towards the other side of the road with the little girl. The little girl was very nervous, looking left and right at the vehicles on both sides, her steps careful and timid. Behind Ano, a young man with his chin resting on his hand seemed thoughtful, then as if he had thought of something, he suddenly realized, "I get it, he's cosplaying the blind monk from League of Legends." The road was not wide, and in just 10 or so seconds, the two had reached the other side of the road. The young man thanked the little girl and then walked towards the secluded alley without looking back. He's not blind. Ano saw this scene and said confidently, "He must be able to see." After a pause of 2 seconds, Ano muttered in a low voice, "Besides, the cloth that the blind monk uses to cover his eyes is red, this cosplay doesn't look like it." "Ano, you're the one who slap dash." A slap landed cleanly on the back of his head, and Ano cursed, "Idiot, all you know is to play games all day. Who the hell would cosplay the blind monk in the middle of the road? Do you have a death wish?" As the two bickered, a young man who had been silent all along was watching the young man's departing figure, his brows slightly furrowed. "What's wrong?" Ano noticed his gaze. "Shut up." "Okay. That's right." The young man nodded. "When my cousin was still in elementary school, I heard that there was a student in their school who had an accident and had problems with his eyes. He could only use black satin to cover his eyes, and it was said that he also had mental issues." "Mental issues?" Ano was taken aback, carefully recalling the situation just now. "I didn't see any problems." "I know him." "You know him?" "I don't know." He paused, "But I heard it was something even more outrageous. He's a poor soul." Ano sighed. "What's his name?" "That was all 10 years ago, maybe he's already recovered. But at the time, the incident seemed to have caused quite a stir, and the student dropped out of school after just a few days." I heard he later transferred to a special school for the blind. Just then, another person excitedly interjected, speaking of which, what kind of accident was it? It actually caused him to go blind and have mental problems. Could it be that he was possessed? In the sunset, Lin Xia pushed the door open. Almost instantly, the smell of cooking from inside the house entered his nostrils. He sniffed, swallowed his saliva, and walked into the house with his things. I think his name is Lin Xia. Little Chi, why did you bring so much stuff back at once? The woman wiped her hands on her apron and hurriedly helped Lin Xia take the things, chattering. Why did you buy such a big bucket of peanut oil? Did you misappropriate the government's subsidy again? Creak dash. The old door made a sharp screech, covering up the sound of cooking from the kitchen. A middle-aged woman pushed open the kitchen door and saw Lin Xia carrying bags of stuff. She exclaimed and hurriedly walked over. Auntie carefully wiped the oil barrel with her hand, looking a little heartbroken, and murmured, such a big barrel of oil, and it's a brand. It must have cost a lot of money, right? Before Lin Xia could say anything, Auntie suddenly realized. Auntie, the government's subsidy for the disabled is meant to be used for living expenses. I used it to buy oil, it's money well spent. Lin Xia smiled. Nonsense, that money is saved for your college tuition, how can you misuse it? I've told you, the money I earn from working is enough to support the three of us. You don't need to spend your own money. Okay, it seems there are still many good people in society. Did you thank them properly? I did. Lin Xia changed the subject, Auntie, where's Jean? Wait, how did you bring so much stuff back? Oh, I met some kind-hearted people on the road who helped me bring it back. Lin Xia said calmly. Hello, I am a doctor from Sunshine Mental Hospital. My surname is Li. He is doing his homework on the balcony. Oh, right, the doctor who came for the routine checkup from the mental hospital this year is resting in the room. You go and see the doctor, I will go and cook. Call you when it's ready. Lin Xia paused slightly, gave an affirmative sound, turned around and walked towards the bedroom. Dr. Han was promoted to deputy director last year. Dr. Li laughed, a hint of envy flashing in his eyes. Lin Xia nodded slightly, acknowledging Dr. Li's words. Upon seeing Lin Xia enter the room, the young man sitting on the small stool in the bedroom stood up and spoke gently. He was wearing a large pair of black-framed glasses, making him look quite refined. Lin Xia raised his eyebrows in surprise. Didn't Dr. Han always come before? I'm sorry, I just arrived and I'm not very familiar with your situation yet. Let me get to know you a little first. Dr. Li apologized. Lin Xia nodded. Indeed, Dr. Han was older and highly skilled, so it was no surprise to Lin Xia that he had been promoted to deputy director. It was also natural for a young doctor to come and conduct a regular checkup on him. Seeing Lin Xia sit down, Dr. Li cleared his throat and pulled out a stack of medical records from his bag. You're 17 this year? Yes. Your name is? Lin Xia. Yes. Dr. Li pondered for a while. Did you change your name? No, why do you ask? Lin Xia was taken aback. Well, the medical records say that you lost your sight 10 years ago and were sent to our hospital for some issues? Yes. Lin Xia was silent for a long time, then shook his head. No. I never changed my name. My parents named me Lin Xia before I was born. That's quite, cough cough. Dr. Li stopped midway, realizing it was impolite, and quickly closed his mouth. Doctor. Li scratched his head in embarrassment. Cough cough. It seems I was overthinking. He pointed at the age on the medical record, then at the words 10 years ago. You see, you lost your sight 10 years ago, when you were exactly 7 years old, and your name just happens to be Lin Xia, so I thought you changed your name after you became blind. Before Lin Xia could respond, Dr. Li quickly added, I didn't mean to offend. Knowing more about the patients can help treat them better, of course. If you don't want to talk about it, I won't insist. Lin Xia sat quietly, under the black ribbon. Those eyes seemed to be staring at Dr. Li. It's a coincidence. Lin Xia spoke softly. Indeed, it's a coincidence. Dr. Li was a bit embarrassed, but he quickly changed the subject. The medical records don't seem to detail the accident that caused your blindness and mental disorder. Can you tell me about it? No, don't think of our relationship as doctor and patient. This is just a normal conversation between friends, it won't go that far. Dr. Li half-jokingly said, even if you tell me you were pulled into the alchemy furnace by the Supreme Old Lord, I'll believe you. Lin Xia was silent for a moment, then nodded. After a while, he slowly spoke, there's nothing I can't say. It's just that, you may not believe it, you might even take me back to the mental hospital. That night, I was lying on the roof of my old house, looking at the moon. What did you see? The moon rabbit? Dr. Li joked. When I was a kid, I liked astronomy. And then? Lin Xia shook his head. his next sentence caused Dr. Li's smile to freeze on his face. No, I saw an angel. Lin Xia spoke seriously, gesturing with his hands in front of him. A seraphim, bathed in golden light with 6 white wings. The room fell into a brief silence. A few seconds later, Dr. Li came to his senses. Seraphim? Yes. What's it doing? Nothing. It's just sitting in the middle of a huge moon crater, looking up at the earth like, watching. Dr. Li rubbed the corner of his eyes, speaking with a hint of helplessness. 7. Do you know how far the moon is from the earth? Nearly 400,000 kilometers. Lin Qiue calmly replied. Nearly 400,000 kilometers. Dr. Li repeated, even with the most advanced telescope, we can only barely see the surface of the moon. But you, when you were 7, were lying under the eaves of your old house and saw an angel on the moon with your naked eyes? But if there really was an angel on the moon, why hasn't it been discovered by humans for so many years? I don't know. Lin Qiue shook his head. Maybe the seraphim doesn't want to be observed. Besides, do humans really understand the moon? Lin Qiue's tone was sincere, so sincere that Dr. Li immediately wanted to call a car to take him back to the mental hospital. It wasn't me who saw it. Lin Qiue began in a low voice, it saw me. I just looked up, and my eyes were dragged through space to meet its gaze. So, it forced you? I suppose so. How else could I see the surface of the moon? I don't have clairvoyance. Dr. Li opened his mouth, looked down at the case in his hand, and fell silent. Under the cause of blindness, only 4 words were written, unknown cause. Doctor. Li was a psychiatrist after all, and he had seen all kinds of mental illnesses. He had summed up a rule in his medical career: the more serious the disease, the more serious the nonsense, and the more convincing it sounds. What about your eyes? What happened? Lin Qiue reached out, gently rubbing the black satin over his eyes, his voice emotionless. That day, I looked at it for a moment, and then I went blind. It was a close call, almost being led astray by a mental patient. He could almost imagine the look on the doctors' faces when the young Lin Qiue, who had gone blind 10 years ago, said those words. No wonder this kid was forced to stay in the hospital. No matter how you look at it, what he said was something that only a mental patient would say. So, what really happened back then? Could it be that, as Lin Qiue said, he saw the seraphim on the moon? Otherwise, how to explain the sudden blindness? This thought only appeared for a moment before Dr. Li immediately killed it. It's all delusions. Lin Qiue calmly said, that day, I just accidentally rolled off the eaves and hit my head on the ground. As for my eyes, maybe some nerve was damaged, so I went blind. He had said this many times, fluently and calmly. Dr. Li raised an eyebrow, wrote something on the case, then chatted with Lin Qiue about daily life. About 20 minutes later, he looked at the time and stood up with a smile. There were many people like this in the hospital, some who claimed to be the reincarnation of the Monkey King and stared blankly at the single bar all day, some who thought they were coat racks and stood still in the room all night, some who saw everyone as their husband and would sneakily touch someone's buttocks. Well, the last patient was a greasy middle-aged man. What do you think of this matter now? Dr. Li adjusted his mood and continued the review process. No, I have another patient to see, so I won't bother you. Dr. Li politely said goodbye to the aunt and then left the room. As the door closed, Lin Qiue's smile disappeared as if it had never existed. Alright, let's stop the review here. Your condition is not a problem anymore. I hope you can adjust your mentality and live a good life. Dr. Li shook hands with Lin Qiue and encouraged him. Lin Qiue smiled and nodded slightly. Hey, Dr. Li, stay for dinner. The aunt saw Dr. Li leaving and enthusiastically invited him to stay. Here I come. Lin Qiue responded. Just as Lin Qiue sat down at the narrow dining table, a warm sensation came from his foot. He was startled for a moment, then the corners of his mouth raised slightly. His cousin, Ong Jin, glanced under the table and laughed. You're such a lazy dog. You're always lazy and don't move, but when it's time to eat, you're faster than anyone else. A small black scabby dog stuck its head out from under the table, its tongue hanging out of its teeth, panting hot air, and approached Lin Qiue, licking his ankles, with a look of flattery on its face. 3 people, 1 dog, this is a family. Brother, are your eyes really almost healed? Lin Qiue gave a slight smile. Yes, I can see now, but I still can't see the light. I need to wrap this black satin for a few more days. What a few days, Shao-Chi, let me tell you, eyes are too important. Even if you can see now, don't be in a hurry to take off this black satin. What if it gets damaged by the sun again? That would be a pity. We should be steady and wear it a little longer. The aunt hurriedly advised. Give it a bone to gnaw on. Yang Jin didn't refuse. With their brotherhood, saying more would seem distant. He was concerned about another matter. Alright. Yang Jin was a little disappointed. But once my eyes are completely healed, I'll take it for a walk every day. I'll also buy you a pair then, and we can go together. Hearing this, Yang Jin's eyes lit up again, and he nodded heavily. I know, aunt. By the way, brother, I saved some money and bought you a cool pair of sunglasses. I'll show you later. Yang Jin seemed to think of something and said excitedly. Lin Qiuya laughed and shook his head. Ah Jin, sunglasses can block the light, but the effect is much worse than black satin. I can't wear them yet. Brother, I can support you too. Lin Qiuya's body trembled slightly, and it was unknown what the expression under the black satin was. His lips were pursed, and then he smiled again. He shook his head firmly. By the way, Xiao Qi, your aunt has prepared everything for your transfer. When this semester starts, you can transfer from the special school to a regular high school. The aunt seemed to think of something and said, but are you really sure? Regular high school is not the same as a special school. With your situation, what if? There's no what if, aunt. Lin Qiuya interrupted her. My eyes are fine now, and if I want to get into a good university, I have to stand on the same starting line as everyone else. You kid, even if you don't get into a good university, it's fine. At worst, your aunt will always support you. He didn't speak, but both Yang Jin and the aunt could feel his determination. Even the little black scabby dog at his feet rubbed against Lin Qiuya's ankle. Woof! Returning to his room, Lin Qiuya shut the door. He didn't turn on the light. It was already late at night. The twinkling starlight outside the window sprinkled on the ground. In the dark room, Lin Qiuya sat at his desk and slowly removed the black satin from his eyes. Reflected in the mirror on the desk was a handsome young face. Lin Qiuya was very good-looking. If he took off his black satin blindfold and tidied himself up a bit, coupled with his inexplicable aloofness and deep temperament, he would undoubtedly be a heartthrob. Unfortunately, he was always blindfolded with black satin, and his identity as a disabled person completely covered his brilliance. In the mirror, Lin Qiuya's eyes were closed, his brow furrowed slightly, his eyelids covering his eyes quivered, as if he was trying hard to open his eyes, even his hands clenched into fists with effort. So close, just a little bit more. Why was it always just a bit short? When would he be able to open his eyes again and see the world for himself? 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, his body trembled for a long time, and finally unable to bear it, he suddenly relaxed, panting heavily. A few drops of sweat trickled down Lin Qiuya's cheeks, and a trace of anger appeared between his brows. Because even with his eyes closed, he could see everything around him clearly. This feeling was very strange, as if his whole body had grown eyes, able to sense everything in all directions without any blind spots, and even see clearer and further than his original eyes. At first, he couldn't do it. In the 5 years after he became blind, he was no different from other blind people. He could only rely on sound and the guide stick in his hand to sense the world. He said he could see now. He was lying, his eyes couldn't open, not even a crack. But he didn't lie either. The key was, the 10 meters he saw were regardless of any obstacles. In other words, within 10 meters of Lin Qiuya, he had an absolute field of vision. Crudely put, he could see through things, but in a more sophisticated way, he could see every dust particle floating in the air, every part inside a machine, every slight movement of a magician under the table, and the source of this ability seemed to be those eyes that had been closed for 10 years under the black satin. But for some reason, starting 5 years ago, his eyes seemed to have changed a bit, and he, too, began to sense his surroundings. At first, it was only a few centimeters in front of him. Later, as time went on, he could see further and clearer. Now, 5 years later, his vision had reached 10 meters. If a normal person could only see 10 meters, then his eyes would basically be useless. But for a boy who had lost his sight, these 10 meters meant everything. He was not far from truly opening his eyes. After washing up, Lin Qiuya, as usual, went to bed early to sleep. The many years of living as a blind person weren't all bad. At least he had developed a good habit of going to bed early. But as soon as he got into bed, unconsciously, that scene appeared in his mind again. Although he had this near superpower, Lin Qiuya was still not satisfied. It was good to have an absolute field of vision of 10 meters, but he wanted to use his own eyes to see the world for himself. This was a young man's persistence. Even though he failed to open his eyes today, he could clearly feel what really imprinted in Lin Qiuya's mind and couldn't be waved away were those eyes, filled with divine power, burning like a furnace, were as dazzling as the sun at close range. He saw those eyes, just a flash, and his world was left with only darkness. Under the dark cosmic sky, on the desolate surface of the moon, the gray land reflected the bleak starlight. In the center of the largest and highest lunar crater stood a figure like a statue. The figure stood quietly, as if it had existed since ancient times, radiating holy golden light. That divine power was enough to make all creatures prostrate on the ground. Behind him, 6 wings as large as exaggerations spread out, blocking the sunlight cast from behind and leaving a huge shadow on the silver-gray ground. Slowly, Lin Qiuya fell into a deep sleep. He didn't know that, the moment he fell asleep, in the dark room, 2 dazzling golden lights shot out from the cracks of his eyes, flashing and disappearing. 10 years ago, he told the truth, but was diagnosed with a mental illness, but he knew best what was real and what was delusion. Ever since he saw the seraph on the moon, he knew that this world was not as simple as it seemed. Lin Qiue looked down at his body and sighed. Again this dream, knocking every night, it's exhausting, isn't it? Lin Qiue shook his head helplessly and took a step forward. The next moment, the fog around him rolled back, and a strange modern building appeared in front of Lin Qiue. Tap, tap, tap. In the world of fog, Lin Qiue walked alone. The fog around him rolled, seemingly endless. Even though he was walking in nothingness, every step Lin Qiue took made a crisp collision sound, as if there was an invisible ground under his feet. He recognized this building, and it looked very familiar. This was very similar to the Sunshine Mental Hospital where he had lived for a year. The most powerful evidence was that the place where the words Sunshine Mental Hospital used to be written at the entrance had been replaced by another line of words, the Gods Mental Hospital. It was strange because it was clearly a modern-style building, but in some details, it was full of mystery. For example, the iron gate carved with countless gods, the lights that burned like fireballs, the floating patterned ceramic tiles under the feet. It was as if the modern architectural style and the elements of the temples in ancient mythology were mixed together. It was incongruous, but there was an indescribable beauty. But the door of this mental hospital was always closed and could not be opened no matter what. Lin Qiue walked around the mental hospital countless times. There was only one entrance at the front iron gate. The walls around it were not high, but the most ridiculous thing was that every time Lin Qiue jumped up, the height of the wall would also increase. As for brute force, even if Lin Qiue broke his body, the iron gate would not move at all. This is a bizarre place. Lin Qiue shook his head, stepped forward, and stood right in front of the big iron gate. 5 years ago, not only his body began to change, but also his dreams. For 5 years, he had the same dream every night, and the protagonist of these dreams was this mysterious God's mental hospital. Dang, like the humming of an ancient bell, the sound echoed in the mental hospital. The iron gate itself shook, wobbled, but didn't open. Dang, the method of entering seemed to be only one. Knock. Lin Qiue grabbed the ring on the iron gate, took a deep breath, and heavily hit the surface of the iron gate. Again, the iron gate still didn't open. Lin Qiue didn't seem surprised, nor annoyed, and continued to knock patiently. Over the past 5 years, he had deeply realized the rules of this dream. Apart from knocking, no other means could open the iron gate. Moreover, in this dream, apart from knocking, he seemed unable to do anything else. Fortunately, in the dream, he wouldn't get tired. Otherwise, his body would have been exhausted long ago. Like a hardworking laborer, Lin Qiue diligently knocked on the door all night. A week later, at the 6th Middle School of Changnan City. Hey, is that person from our school? Why is there a cloth covering his eyes? He's wearing our school uniform, he must be from our school. He's also holding a guide stick in his hand, looks like he's blind. That's strange, why haven't we seen him before? He must be a new freshman this year, right? But you know, he looks quite handsome with that black cloth wrapped around his eyes. But can a blind person attend classes? Our school doesn't seem to have any special classes, does it? I have no idea. As expected, the moment Lin Qiue stepped into the school gate, he attracted a lot of attention, but he was used to such scenes. He walked through the school's Maple Leaf Avenue towards the teaching building, ignoring the curious gazes. This made Lin Qiue feel somewhat disappointed. After all, they were all modern students who have undergone 9 years of compulsory education. Who would be foolish enough to cause trouble? Even if there were some small groups, they would probably adhere to the code of brotherhood, helping each other out in daily life. If they really bullied a disabled person, they would be drowned in public scorn the next day, completely discredited. Before coming here, Lin Qiue had prepared himself to face these troublemakers. In many mindless novels, under such circumstances, there would definitely be some foolish, schooled bullies who would mock him, setting the stage for his future counterattack. However, those troublemakers didn't show up. Instead, many students took the initiative to approach him, asking if he needed help. Lin Qiue was clear that he was not an outgoing person. Even if he had been in the same class with them since the first year of high school, with his aloof personality, he would probably still be alone. Lin Qiue walked up the stairs and quickly found his classroom, grade 2, class 2. He had already spent a year in a special school, and now he was transferring to this school, which made him a transfer student. In many TV shows and novels, transfer students are often depicted as lonely, isolated, and miserable. After all, during the first year of high school, various groups have already been formed. If he doesn't take the initiative, it's hard to really fit into the class. Standing at the door of the classroom, Lin Qiue took a deep breath to calm himself, and walked in. The moment Lin Qiue entered the class, the noisy classroom suddenly became quiet, and the air seemed to stand still. But being alone wasn't a bad thing. At least Lin Qiue himself enjoyed that feeling. No one bothered him, he could focus on his studies. If he were to deliberately make friends with others, he wouldn't know how to. You must be Lin Qiue, right? Your seat is ready, it's over there. Lin Qiue, are you unable to see? Let me guide you. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, Just as Lin Qiue was about to say something, the class suddenly exploded. Before Lin Qiue could react, several classmates had already come up to him, carefully guiding him to his seat. A tall boy even took his backpack and carried it on his shoulder. With many people surrounding him, Lin Qiue safely reached his seat. "Classmate, walk slowly, there are many things on the aisle. Who's that? Quickly put your backpack away." "Lin Qiue, I'm the class president, Jiang Qian. If you need anything, you can come to me." A girl with a ponytail patted her chest and said, "My name is Li Yifei. If you want to go to the cafeteria, just let me know, I'll take you there." The boy who was carrying his backpack smiled. "Lin Qiue, this doesn't seem to follow the script." Many people surrounded him, greeting him warmly. For a moment, Lin Qiue was somewhat at a loss. "And me, my name is Wang Xiao, the class teacher has told us about you." Class President Jiang Qian answered, "But the one who left the deepest impression on us is your aunt. That day, she brought a basket of eggs and stood here, giving each of us an egg, begging us to take care of you." A thunder seemed to explode in Lin Qiue's mind, and he stood still. To be honest, this was quite different from his imagination. "Do you know me?" Lin Qiue asked with a peculiar expression. "Young girl, you're really pretty. My nephew is also very handsome, you'll definitely like him." Qiue is a cold person on the outside but warm on the inside. "As long as you get to know him, you'll definitely get along well." What the classmates said next, he could no longer hear. He just stared at the classroom blankly, and the image of a middle-aged woman with a hunched back, holding a basket of freshly boiled eggs, pleading with the students, involuntarily surfaced in his mind. "Classmates, please, my nephew's eyes aren't very good and he's a bit cold. Please take care of him, aunt." He murmured. Just as everyone was chatting, a female teacher walked in with a book. Seeing Lin Qiue sitting in the front row, she first comforted him a few words, then briefly introduced him to the class, and started the lesson. From some point, the black ribbon became slightly damp. 100 years ago, there were more than 200 countries on Earth, distributed across 7 continents and 4 oceans, with different customs and cultures. Even in that era of undeveloped technology, we could still travel to different countries by boat and experience the collision of cultures. However, on March 9th, a mysterious fog suddenly appeared in Antarctica, and then spread at an astonishing speed, swallowing nearly 98% of the Earth's surface in just 24 hours. Everyone, please turn to page 91 of your textbook. Today we are going to talk about the history and dilemma of modern Daxia. No one knew why, but it just mysteriously stopped. Over the past 100 years, countless theories and speculations have been put forward. Some people say that this fog is actually a kind of creature, which stopped near Daxia after swallowing 98% of the Earth because it was full. Some people say that the special magnetic field where Daxia is located is impeding the spread of the fog. Others say that this is the result of Daxia's 5,000 years of accumulated heritage, protecting this land. Man-made skyscrapers, ancient forests, and unfathomable oceans, everything was covered by the fog. Countless countries fell into the fog, lost all contact. However, this bizarre fog stopped just as it was about to invade Daxia's territory. Over the past century, our country has sent numerous well-equipped exploration teams into the fog, but not one person has returned. It is speculated by experts that their chances of survival in the fog are extremely low, because this fog is lethal whether it is inhaled into the lungs or comes into contact with the skin. The composition of this fog completely surpasses human understanding. No matter whether it is light, sound, radio waves, or any other detection methods, none of them can penetrate this fog. No one knows whether the other countries that were swallowed by the fog 100 years ago still exist. 50 years ago, our country's first satellite was successfully launched. The images transmitted back from space showed that the entire Earth had turned gray, with only Daxia remaining as a pure land. Daxia now is like an island on this planet, and we might be the last survivors on this planet. Therefore, the day the fog appeared, which is March 9th every year, is known as Survivors' Day. The moon is sparse with stars, the bell rang at the end of the evening self-study, and students walked out of the classroom in groups of 3 or 2, chatting and laughing in the dark. After a day of torment, this might be their most relaxed time. No homework, no teachers, surrounded by a few good friends, you can go home and take a shower and comfortably go to bed. Isn't it wonderful? Among these scattered people, a team of more than a dozen people came out, marching steadily towards the school gate. In the middle of them, a teenager with black satin bandages on his eyes was like the filling of a dumpling, tightly wrapped. Such a large team immediately attracted the attention of all the surrounding students. I'm also on the way. Lin Qiue, to be honest, he now hopes that he is the isolated one. After staying in the dark for a long time, he is not used to being cared about by too many people, which makes him feel awkward. Actually, I can walk home by myself, really. Lin Qiue twitched slightly at the corner of his mouth and opened his mouth helplessly. I can see, but my eyes can't stand the light. Don't say it, Lin Qiue. Jiang Qian interrupted Lin Qiue's words and said sternly, we promised your aunt to take care of you, and we will definitely do it. Oh gee yes, Xia, our homes are in the same direction, so it's on the way. I have to turn right at the intersection ahead, but I can walk a little further with you. You didn't listen to what those experts said? The probability of the revival of the mist is very small, maybe there will be no change in the recent 100 years, as for what will happen after 100 years. Anyway, we are not there at that time, why worry about it? Jiang Qian rolled her eyes. Damn, you don't know, what those so-called experts say is the most unreliable. What if we finally get into college, haven't enjoyed life yet, and the mist swallowed the whole daxia, isn't that a loss? So this is why you are messing around every day and not concentrating on studying? Jiang Qian walked in front of Li Yifei and said solemnly, I have to remind you that Teacher Wang has already said that if you are the last one in this exam, you will have to move your desk to the podium. As they got further and further away from the school, the students around Lin Qiue said goodbye and left one after another. A few minutes later, there were only 5 people left around Lin Qiue. The originally noisy atmosphere gradually quieted down, and the space suddenly became ample. Lin Qiue took a long sigh of relief. Do you think, will the mist really revive and swallow daxia? Li Yifei carried his bag and turned his head curiously. What if, this mist is not a natural phenomenon? At this moment, Lin Qiue, who had been silent, suddenly spoke. Wang Xiao was stunned, and then laughed. Qiue, you don't really believe what those so-called theologians say, do you think this mist has something to do with supernatural powers? It's the 21st century, we have to believe in science, there are not so many ghosts and gods in the world. A student named Lu Yuan added. I know. Li Yifei smiled awkwardly. But, I really don't think the mist will revive. Wang Xiao, who was walking in the front, suddenly spoke up, after all, the mist is just a natural phenomenon. After reaching a certain critical level, it will gradually fade away, just like the Ice Age. After the glaciers cover the earth, as the temperature rises, it will slowly fade away, and a new era will come. I know what you're talking about, it seems to be called the natural disaster theory, right? It's quite popular now. Jiang Qian nodded. Yes, holidays are the most real. At this moment, in the old city of Changnan, Lin Qiue did not answer. He knew best whether there were things beyond science in this world, but there was no need to tell outsiders about these things. Li Yifei muttered to himself, I think, if there are really those things, the world should be more interesting. Why bother with so many useless things? These things are not what we should care about. Instead of worrying about whether the mist will come back, it's more realistic to sleep more on the 3-day holiday of the day of survival. Jiang Qian laughed as he muttered, put down the sign he was carrying on his shoulder, and straightened it. Under the flickering street lamp, the shadow of the sign flickered, and on the black background, the bright red characters were extremely eye-catching. No entry ahead. A man was carrying a sign, walking leisurely on the lonely and dim street. The old street lamp shed dim light, constantly stretching his shadow. He glanced at his mobile phone, walked to a narrow street entrance, and stopped. This is it, yes. The man took a cigarette in his mouth, stepped in front of the sign, put his thumb on the tip of his tooth, and bit hard. A drop of blood overflowed from the wound. The man squatted down, and drew a long line on the 4 big characters, no entry ahead. With his blood-stained thumb, the man leaned against the street lamp, lit a cigarette for himself, took a hard puff, and then turned on the earphone. Captain, the 3rd sign is in place. Received, start. The next moment, the bright red blood stains on the sign in front of him faded quickly, as if absorbed, and then the 4 big characters, no entry ahead, flashed red. Then it gradually returned to its original state. The man sat on the ground with a thump, took a long sigh of relief, and opened his mouth somewhat complainingly. His eyes condensed, and an inexplicable momentum erupted from him. He looked up at the black night sky, and murmured in a voice that only he could hear, Forbidden Ruins. No ring airspace. But from the ground, the old city is still the old city. At the same time, if someone looks down at Changnan City from the sky, they will find that near the old city, 3 points of light are flashing, and then a dark red equilateral triangle is quickly drawn with these 3 points of light as the apex. As soon as the triangle was formed, the half of the old city that was covered gradually disappeared as if it had been erased from the map. Damn, it's hollowed out again. At this moment, if there are 6 black and red cloaks flying across the sky like lightning in the center of this triangle, the man leading the way looked up at the dark red sky, reached out to hold the hilt of the knife behind him, and narrowed his eyes slightly. Ghost Face Man Purge Operation, start. Outside the old city, the man who had just opened the Forbidden Ruins was sitting next to a signboard, glancing back at the half of the old city that was as still as a painting. He shook his head helplessly, pulling out his phone to play Candy Crush. Hey, brother, why are you sitting here playing with your phone in the middle of the night? Aren't you afraid of catching a cold? Before long, a passerby walked over from the opposite side of the road, laughing at the sight. The man looked up at him, then lowered his head to continue playing his game. Nothing to do, just killing time. The passerby chuckled, pulling out a cigarette from his pocket and offering it to the man. The man waved his hand, seriously saying, I'm on duty, don't smoke. "Ha, you squatting on the road playing with your phone, this also counts as work?" The passerby laughed. "Go home. You can't go back, at least not now." The passerby raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Okay then." The passerby shrugged, standing up and walking towards the street behind the man. "Where are you going?" The man suddenly asked. A few seconds later, he stiffly turned around, step by step returning the way he had come, his eyes filled with confusion. The man seemed not at all surprised by this. Just as he was about to resume playing Candy Crush, another man's voice suddenly sounded in his earpiece. "Zhao Kongcheng. This road is blocked for now, you can go back when it's open." The man pointed to the signboard behind him. The passerby followed his finger, looking at the inexplicable sign standing in the middle of the road. Just as he was about to say something, a faint light flashed across the 4 big characters that read, "No entry." The passerby's eyes suddenly became blank. Ghostface King. Zhao Kongcheng's face changed. Which direction did he run? "I'll intercept him." "No, Kongcheng, you're not good at fighting, you can't beat the Ghostface King, I'll chase him." Zhao Kongcheng was taken aback. The moment this voice sounded, the man suddenly sat up from the ground. The leisure and fatigue on his face disappeared, replaced by absolute seriousness. "Arrived. Captain, what happened?" "Something went wrong. A Ghostface King has been promoted among these Ghostface people. While we were rounding up the other Ghostface people, he violently injured Hong Ying and escaped from the sewer system beyond the scope of the Forbidden Ruins." "Okay." Zhao Kongcheng's eyes flashed with a sharp light. He ran quickly to the other end of the street, jumped into a black van, slammed the accelerator, and sped away with a roar. On his passenger seat, a black and red cloak was neatly folded. After the Ghostface King escaped, 2 more Ghostface people took the opportunity to flee into the sewer. The others are clearing up the remaining Ghostface people and can't get away. "Which direction?" "Southeast." Wang Xiao stopped, turning back to the 4 people behind him. Just then, Li Fei seemed to suddenly remember something. "Wang Xiao, isn't your home next to the old city?" "Yes, why?" "And a straight sword in its sheath." "Okay, I have to turn here, I'll go first." "A psychopathic killer? Really or not?" Jiang Qian was somewhat skeptical. "Of course it's true." Li Fei looked around, lowering his voice. "You guys probably don't know, but in the last few days, more than a dozen people have already died in the old city." "More than a dozen people?" "Impossible, if there was such a big commotion, the news would have reported it by now." Wang Xiao shook his head. "Nothing, just be careful on your way home." Wang Xiao's mouth twitched slightly, rolling his eyes. "If you have something to say, just say it, don't stop halfway, it makes people uncomfortable." Li Fei hesitated for a moment. "I heard that the old city has been restless recently, there's a psychopathic killer. They say that the people who died, their whole faces were peeled off, leaving only a mass of bloody flesh and protruding eyeballs on their faces. The methods were extremely brutal." The cool evening breeze brushed past, and when they heard these words, they felt a chill from their feet to their heads. "Li Fei. Are you sick, talking about these things in the middle of the night?" Jiang Qian's face was pale. She subconsciously looked around the quiet street, annoyed. How is it impossible? Let me tell you, this incident happened strangely. Someone up there forcefully suppressed the news. If it wasn't for my dad working in the police station, I wouldn't know about it." "Strange? What's strange?" "They say." Li Fei paused, lowering his voice even further. Lin Chuya thought for a moment, then said in a low voice, "Are you sure, these things were done by humans?" "Chuya, you." Jiang Qian shivered. Wang Xiao and Lu Yuan's mouths twitched slightly. Their looks towards Lin Chuya suddenly became strange. This place was already close to the old city, a remote area of Cangnan City, and it was nearly 10 o'clock when evening self-study ended. There wasn't a single pedestrian on the road, and coupled with Li Fei's words, it really made people feel a bit creepy. Not just her, even Wang Xiao and Lu Yuan, the 2 big men, were a bit scared. Wang Xiao glanced at the narrow alley he was about to walk down, and suddenly felt a bit uneasy. If Li Fei's words just scared them a bit, then Lin Chuya's next words made their scalps tingle. "Stop telling ghost stories in the middle of the night. I have to go home later." Li Fei clutched his arm, wincing in pain, muttering under his breath, "This is not a ghost story." Wang Xiao shrugged, "I'm not going to talk nonsense with you guys, I just don't believe in these ghosts and gods, I'm leaving." "Good for you, Lin Chuya with your thick eyebrows and big eyes, who would have thought that the one who hid the deepest would be you?" Li Fei looked at Lin Chuya in surprise. "You think so too?" "Shut up, shut up, shut up." Jiang Qian couldn't take it anymore. She twisted Li Fei's arm hard, causing him to cry out in pain. A look of confusion appeared in her eyes. She turned her head and said, "Do you smell a stink?" "Stink?" Wang Xiao's figure gradually disappeared into the narrow alley. Jiang Qian glared at Li Yifei again, walked a few steps forward, then suddenly stopped. She sniffed hard, her eyebrows furrowed. Lu Yuan and Li Yifei hadn't finished speaking, their faces suddenly changed. They quickly covered their noses, looking around in horror. Just as Lin Qiuye was about to say something, a nauseating stench suddenly filled his nostrils. This feeling was like throwing a piece of meat that had been rotting for more than 10 days into a septic tank, then mixing it with a dozen rotten eggs. Just one sniff made his stomach churn. This was the stinkiest smell Lin Qiuye had ever smelled in his life. That kind of smell, like something rotten. I didn't smell it, did you, Lu Yuan? I didn't, vomit. As for the most sensitive-nosed Jiang Qian, she immediately squatted down and started vomiting. Damn, what the hell is so stinky? Li Yifei shouted, covering his nose. I don't know. Lin Qiuye's eyebrows furrowed slightly. After a moment, he pointed towards the alley where Wang Xiao had left. But judging from the direction the smell is coming from, it seems to be coming from over there. The next moment, a sharp scream came from not far away, echoing in the quiet night sky. Wang Xiao. When Li Yifei and his two companions heard this familiar voice, they all exclaimed in unison. They exchanged a glance and ran towards the alley where Wang Xiao had disappeared. Lin Qi stood alone, frowning at the dark alley with a somber expression that he wasn't sure what had happened, but he had a bad feeling about it. The outskirts of the old city, the deranged killer, the eerie stench, the screams, something was off. After hesitating for a while, Lin Qi sighed helplessly, picked up his cane, and dashed towards the alley. Normally, Lin Qi would not meddle in such situations. On the contrary, he would run in the opposite direction as far as possible. He didn't have a strong curiosity to know what had happened, nor did he have an overflowing sympathy to play the hero. Most importantly, he couldn't fight. What if he lost his life? But this situation was different. Since there were screams, it indicated that something bad had happened, and something bad meant trouble, robbery, murder, or witnessing a crime scene. Any one of these, Lin Qi wanted no part of. Regardless, he felt obligated to at least check out what had happened. If there was any danger, he would simply run away. Although Lin Qi was blind, he was fast. The closer he got to where the screams came from, the more furrowed his brows became. The stench was getting stronger. Even though Lin Qi didn't want to admit it, Wang Xiao's danger was somewhat related to him. If they hadn't insisted on escorting him home, Wang Xiao might have taken another route or left a few minutes earlier and avoided this situation. He didn't like to meddle, but he liked owing favors even less. Suddenly, Lin Qi stopped at the corner of the alley. His spiritual senses picked up the figures of Jiang Qian and his two companions. Not far in front of him, Jiang Qian was crouched on the ground, her mouth agape in terror, her whole body trembling. In front of her, Lu Yuan and Li Yifei stood like statues, their eyes fixed on the area in front of them, also shaking. Ah! The second scream came from around the corner, this time from a woman, Jiang Qian. What had Jiang Qian and the others seen to frighten them so much? He couldn't see, but his hearing was very sharp. He could clearly hear a rustling sound not far away. It sounded like someone was gnawing on something, ferociously and with relish, further away. Lin Qi couldn't sense anything, his eyes were still closed, unable to see the world with his own vision. His spiritual senses only stretched 10 meters, so he was in an awkward situation. Within 10 meters, he could perceive everything. Beyond 10 meters, he was a true blind man. A monster is gnawing on Wang Xiao's face. Lin Qi's face turned pale. Run! It sounds like Xiao Hailai gnawing on a bone. What happened? Lin Qi asked in a low voice. Jiang Qian seemed to be startled by Lin Qi's appearance. Her hands frantically grabbed his clothes, her teeth chattering. Just as Lin Qi had barely steadied himself, a dull thud came from a distance. It sounded like a brown bear stomping on the ground, rushing towards him. Jiang Qian's pupils contracted, and she somehow managed to get up from the ground and ran away screaming. Lin Qi and Li Yifei both yelled at the same time. The word had barely left his mouth when Lu Yuan, like a mad dog, turned around and ran wildly. After bumping into Lin Qi and stumbling, he quickly got up and ran for his life. Monster, help! Someone! Monster! He screamed as he ran. At this point, it seemed that everyone had forgotten that Lin Qi was disabled. The classmates who had just sworn to escort him home had completely forgotten about him. Oh, not completely. After all, they had just bumped into him. Lin Qi sneered. As for Li Yifei, he had already run away as soon as he shouted the word run. His speed was even faster than Lu Yuan, who had just pushed Lin Qi. If it weren't for Lu Yuan, this beast, who had just caused Lin Qi to stumble, he would have run far away by now. But just this moment of delay, he was left behind like Jiang Qian. Most importantly, it had a ghostly face on its head, pale, distorted. That long, blood-red tongue was like a long snake, extending half a meter out of its mouth, twisting flexibly. But now he didn't have time to care about these things. As soon as he had run a few steps, something broke into his 10-meter range of spiritual sense. It looked like a person, but not quite. It was like a person because it had 4 limbs and a head like a human. But it wasn't like a person because it was running on all fours like a hyena, and its bulky body was like a brown bear. Lin Chi calculated the distance from here to the alley in his mind, and his heart sank. With the difference in speed between the two, he would be caught before he could get out of the alley. What other options were there? Lin Chi's face became grim. It was too fast. In a few steps, it had darted from 10 meters away into his range of spiritual sense, and it was still closing in on him at an alarming speed. Lin Chi was sure that even the world sprint champion couldn't outrun it. As Lin Chi was trying to figure out a solution, his spiritual sense fell on Jiang Qian's backpack. Throw your backpack at it. Slow it down. Lin Chi roared. She was pale as a sheet, like a frightened rabbit, her face full of terror, but her eyes were filled with unprecedented ferocity. You're Lin Chi, right? Your seat is ready, it's over there. Lin Chi, I'm the class president, Jiang Qian. You can come to me if you need anything, but now, I want to live. Then, I did say I'd help you more. I did promise your aunt to take care of you. I can help you with your homework, walk you home, help you with your meals. None of these are a problem. This was Jiang Qian's choice. The backpack wasn't heavy, and it didn't have much momentum, but it was enough to make Lin Chi stumble. Behind him, the rapidly approaching monster leaped, aiming for Lin Chi, who was now at the back. Please, just die. That moment, time seemed to stand still. Lin Chi looked at Jiang Qian, his eyes cold and deep like the night sky. Throwing a backpack couldn't delay the monster for a few seconds, but throwing a person, the chances of survival were greater. At the same time, the cane he had been holding all along swept forward like lightning, striking Jiang Qian's ankle. Jiang Qian let out a cry, lost her balance and fell to the ground. His back seemed to have eyes. Predicting the monster's trajectory, he suddenly crouched down, accurately avoiding the monster's pounce. In the blink of an eye, Lin Chi laughed. His laugh was cold. A heavy shadow suddenly fell, landing on her. The next moment, the night was dyed crimson with fresh blood. Jiang Qian was dead. Lin Qiue witnessed the entire process of her death. A monster descended from the sky, as easily as cutting through tofu. It sliced open her throat with its claws, and then began to feast on her with delight. Until her last moment, Jiang Qian's eyes were fixed on Lin Qiue, filled with terror and resentment. Lin Qiue's mind was acutely aware of every detail. His stomach churned, almost causing him to vomit. Despite having endured numerous hardships and trials, and having matured far beyond his peers, this was the first time he had witnessed such a bloody scene. But now was not the time to vomit. Without the slightest hesitation, Lin Qiue turned and ran towards the other end of the alley while the monster was preoccupied with feasting on Jiang Qian's body. If someone suggested that the creature was a human mutated by radiation, he might believe it. Its size, strength, and speed were far beyond what a normal human could contend with, but that was just a might.in. This world shrouded in mist, having witnessed the existence of seraphs, he did not believe that science was the only truth in the world. His original escape route had been blocked by the monster, so he had no choice but to run in the direction where Wang Shou had fallen victim. The monster seemed more interested in the corpse. It didn't follow him, which allowed Lin Qiue to breathe a sigh of relief. He didn't know what the monster was, but there was no doubt that it did not belong to the category of human, nor did it belong to any known category of beast. His breathing became increasingly labored. 10 meters in front of him, the figure of the monster appeared again. Lin Qiue was sure that it was not the same one from before. Although it looked similarly ugly, it was definitely not the same one. He believed in the existence of the mysterious, and Lin Qiue always felt that he had heard of this kind of monster somewhere before. As he was lost in thought, something else entered his mental perception. Lin Qiue abruptly stopped in his tracks. It was the same one that had killed Wang Shou. When he was with Jiang Qian and the others earlier, he didn't see what was happening 10 meters away and subconsciously thought there was only one monster. But thinking about it now, he was very wrong. From the behavior of the monster that killed Jiang Qian, it could be seen that these monsters preferred to eat corpses rather than chase living people. Otherwise, Lin Qiue would not have been able to escape the scene. The most obvious evidence was that in the arms of this monster lay the body of the already dead Wang Shou, and it was still feasting on him. At this point, Wang Shou's face had completely disappeared, leaving only a vague mass of flesh and blood. If it weren't for his distinctive clothing, Lin Qiue might not have recognized him at all. This was the second monster. Lin Qiue's face turned pale. A feeling of despair, which he had not felt in a long time, surfaced in his heart. In the past 17 years, there have only been 2 instances that truly made him despair. One was 10 years ago when he saw the pair of eyes on the moon. The other time was now in front of him, the monster that had finished eating its face threw away Wang Shou's body like it was trash, then turned its head to look at Lin Qiue, its long red tongue licking the blood from the corner of its mouth. At this moment, Lin Qiue wanted to curse. Why was it him who always ended up so unlucky? When he was a child, even climbing a roof would lead him to see a seraph, which blinded him and caused him to fall off the roof. Then people thought he had gone mad and he ended up in a mental hospital for a year. And now, just when he had finally pulled through, was ready to study hard for the college entrance exam and embrace a new life, he encountered this disgusting creature. Even Auntie and Yang Jin didn't know how much anger and resentment this oppressed young man had hidden in his heart. Over the past 10 years, he would not accept it. Perhaps even he himself hadn't realized that under the impact of this raging emotion, his eyes, which had been closed for 10 years, were shaking violently, as if they were about to open at any moment. This anger was burning fiercely, the fear in his heart was compressed smaller and smaller, and a toughness that he didn't know where it came from suddenly surged out. He clenched his guide stick tightly. In front of the monster that was ready to pounce, his chest heaved violently. At this moment, what stood in front of him seemed not to be a monster that had just finished eating a person, but all the grievances and setbacks he had suffered in the past 10 years. The distance between the two rapidly shortened. Just as the monster's claws were about to slash Lin Qiue's throat, he suddenly sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the strike. However, although Lin Qiue could perfectly track the monster's movements, his own physical fitness was somewhat lacking, and the monster's claw grazed his temple, leaving a faint trail of blood. Jia! The monster, looking at the tender-skinned Lin Qiue, let out a shriek, like a rogue who had seen a beautiful woman, and pounced. Damn it, I'm not afraid of you. Lin Qiue roared, holding his guide stick. He actually charged towards the leaping monster. A crisp sound echoed. Lin Qiue felt a lightness in his hand, then a huge force came from his back. The monster's tail directly whipped him away. Lin Qiue was whipped onto the ground and rolled a few times. He gritted his teeth to bear the pain and got up. His mental perception told him that the guide stick in his hand had been broken in two. The guide stick was originally for guiding the blind, its material was not particularly strong, and when it collided with the hard monster, it naturally couldn't stand it. At the same time, the black ribbon was cut off and was blown away by the wind to an unknown place. Lin Qiue, with his eyes closed, seized the opportunity, shouted loudly, and stabbed the guide stick towards the monster's lower abdomen. Snap! The breaking of the guide stick was like a fuse, directly igniting all the emotions in Lin Qiue. He stood there, his hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his flesh, leaving trails of blood. I won't accept it. He roared. At this moment of emotional turmoil, a strange feeling suddenly surged in his heart. Damn it! He cursed, throwing the half-broken guide stick on the ground. He had finally seized an opportunity, and it was wasted just like that. So, naturally, he opened his eyes, which had been closed for 10 years, and the last thing this pair of eyes saw was another pair of eyes. Like a spring rain nourishing the earth, everything fell into place. A coolness flowed from his heart to the blockage in his mind, lightly touching that thin layer of paper, then burst open. Lin Qiue felt as if a sun had exploded in his body. An unprecedented heat filled his entire body. His eyes under his eyelids felt as if they were being grilled, scorching hot. The eyes of the seraph. In an instant, a dazzling and hot beam of light burst out from the edge of the old city, directly piercing the sky. At this moment, the night was as bright as day. So bright. What is that? Is there a fire somewhere? How can that be? Fires aren't that bright. And there are no buildings that tall in our city of Changnan. Quick, quick, quick. Take a picture. Post it on your social circle. This pillar of light reaching into the sky was too dazzling, attracting the attention of half the city's inhabitants. Pedestrians stopped in their tracks, excitedly guessing the cause of this spectacle. Some said it was an explosion, others a light experiment, and some even suggested a miracle, but only a few knew what the appearance of this pillar of light truly signified. 2 minutes earlier, in the old city district. On the deserted street, ripples of space emerged, as if someone had lifted a corner of the canvas that covered the old city district. 5 figures in black and red cloaks stepped out. The horrifying sight of blood soaked the old streets, with scattered monstrous limbs everywhere. If Lin Qiue saw this, he would realize that the creatures chopped into pieces and scattered on the ground were the same faceless monsters he was facing. There were at least 34 of them. One of the figures glanced around before stepping forward to pick up a "No Entry" sign from the ground and folding it up. The moment the sign was folded, the silent old city district silently shattered like a bubble, revealing the true old city district within. Chasing the 2 faceless men who ran away. We were negligent. The injured woman, clutching her right shoulder, looked somewhat dispirited. No restraint zone recovery complete. The man holding the sign spoke faintly. You can call the logistics team to clean up the battlefield now. Where's Xiao? Of course he's fine. Don't forget, our captain is a river realm powerhouse, he won't have any accidents. The man paused. I just hope those 2 escaped faceless men won't cause casualties among ordinary people. As soon as he finished, a scorching pillar of light rose from another direction, illuminating half of the sky. Don't say that, Hongying. No one knew that there was a faceless king hidden among these faceless men. The man beside her comforted. Can the captain handle the faceless king by himself? A forbidden zone has emerged. This energy fluctuation, it's off the charts. This is at least a boundless realm powerhouse. No, it might even be a Klein. How could such a powerhouse be drawn to a small city like Changnan? The 5 of them turned their heads at the same time, their eyes filled with shock. That is, it looks like a god's forbidden zone, also known as God's domain. Hearing the word God, everyone's gaze focused. No, it doesn't look like a human's forbidden zone. The man furrowed his brows. Hong Ying was stunned, then seemed to think of something. You mean, God code number 003, the King of Angels, Michael. Which God? Burning, holy, powerful, and this creation aura, if I'm not wrong, this should be. The man stared intently at the gradually dissipating pillar of light, and spoke word by word. Lin Xia felt as if he had returned to 10 years ago, once again looking at those eyes across the vast universe, that supreme and holy aura. He still remembered vividly. Lin Xia felt very uncomfortable that in the center of this golden pillar of light. His body had completely lost control, eerily floating in midair, with endless energy gushing from his eyes. 10 years ago, the Archangel Michael had looked at him from the moon for a moment. 10 years later, Lin Xia opened his eyes, and the remnants of the Archangel's power in his eyes erupted completely. The difference was that the aura 10 years ago came from the moon, while now this aura came from his own eyes. The aura and divine power of the Archangel were pouring out of his eyes like mad. His eyes were like two burning suns, seemingly about to melt everything into nothingness. If the previous brightness was equivalent to the sun, then the current brightness was just a candlelight. Although the golden light that erupted earlier was incredibly powerful, it didn't belong to him. But now, the golden halo lurking in Lin Xia's eyes was truly under his control. Fortunately, the remnants of the Archangel's power in Lin Xia's eyes weren't much, and the pillar of light dissipated after about 7 or 8 seconds. Lin Xia's body fell from midair, and he staggered to steady himself. The dazzling golden light in his eyes gradually dimmed, leaving only a faint golden halo. The dark night sky, the old streets, the horrifying monsters, the blood everywhere. When this far from beautiful picture unfolded before Lin Xia's eyes, he laughed. He laughed very happily. A faint trace of the Archangel's power. Lin Xia took a deep breath and slowly lifted his head. As soon as the Archangel's divine power erupted from Lin Xia, the two monsters were pinned to the ground by the divine power, almost crushed into meat patties. It wasn't until the golden pillar of light disappeared that they regained their senses, looking around a bit bewildered, then continued to stare at Lin Xia. It had been 10 years, and he was finally able to see the world again with his own eyes. This moment, the blood-soaked monster in Lin Xia's eyes seemed somewhat cute. One of the monsters let out a cry and pounced at Lin Xia. Compared to before, Lin Xia was clearly much calmer now. The moment the monster moved, he had already determined its trajectory in his mind and threw himself to the side with all his might. A bloodthirsty desire surfaced in his eyes. Hiss! One was the range of his spiritual perception, which expanded from 10 meters to 20 meters. It took Lin Xia 5 years to be able to detect 10 meters, and now he had doubled that. The other was dynamic vision. Although Lin Xia's speed was slow compared to the monster, his reaction speed was incredibly fast. The few seconds of early prediction could buy him time to dodge. It wasn't that he could predict the future, but that after opening his eyes, his perception ability had undergone a drastic change. However, the current situation didn't allow him to slowly explore. The monster flew like an arrow, passing by where Lin Xia had just stood, and knocked down a large chunk of the wall. Its limbs pushed hard against the rubble of the wall, and it shot towards Lin Xia again. Within this 20-meter range, Lin Xia had a dynamic vision 3 times that of ordinary people, and his reflexes were freakish. In close combat, he could almost predict the future. As for the other abilities these eyes gave him, Lin Xia hadn't felt them yet. The monster left behind trails of afterimages, the wind stirred up by its speed blowing up Lin Xia's hair, its hind legs pushed hard, and its entire body soared into the air. At this moment, Lin Xia had already rolled to avoid the monster's landing point, reached out to touch the ground beside him, and grabbed the half of the guide cane that had fallen earlier. Lin Xia quickly got up, half-crouched, his eyes fixed on the rapidly approaching monster, his hands tightly gripping the guide cane. Hiss! The monster's claw lashed out, aiming directly at Lin Xia's neck. This time, Lin Xia didn't dodge. He gripped the half of the guide cane tightly, his eyes fixed on the monster's eyes. A strand of divine power was infused into the monster's body through Lin Xia's eyes as a medium. At this moment, the Lin Xia in the monster's eyes changed, becoming a supreme god with 6 wings, radiating a terrifying pressure. Just as it was about to touch Lin Xia, his eyes suddenly contracted, the faint golden halo in his eyes, like a fire fed with wood, suddenly brightened, like 2 blazing furnaces. Under this divine power, its body fell into a brief stiffness. In this brief moment, Lin Xia lifted the half-guide cane high in his hand, and thrust it accurately into the monster's right eye. The sharp broken pole pierced through the monster's brain, erasing all signs of its vitality. Nevertheless, its inertia from the jump still existed. Its massive body fell like a cannonball, knocking down Lin Xia, who was holding the broken pole, to the ground. In the end, Lin Xia was able to kill this monster purely based on his abnormal dynamic vision and the divine power of the seraphim. His own strength hadn't increased. This monster weighed at least 200 kilograms, which he couldn't shake off in a short time. Moreover, right after Lin Xia forcibly used the divine power of the seraphim, he felt as if he had been drained, without a shred of strength throughout his body, and even felt a little dizzy. It ran swiftly with its 4 limbs, its shadow darting under the flickering dim streetlights, its long red tongue twisting in a bizarre manner. Lin Xia could see its movements clearly, but he was unable to dodge at this moment, and could only watch helplessly as the monster's dense fangs rapidly enlarged in front of his eyes. But just then, the second monster that had been hiding on the other side moved. This hunter, who had been hiding in the distance, finally revealed its hideous fangs, that seemed to be a real person. Just as the monster was about to reach Lin Xia, his pupils suddenly contracted. Within his perception, something faster than the monster was rapidly approaching. Not handsome, nor ugly, he looked like an ordinary middle-aged man you could encounter anywhere on the street, someone easily overlooked. However, the murderous intent in his eyes was as dazzling as a shining sword. Whoosh! All Lin Xia could see was a blur as a figure descended from the night sky, landing steadily on the ground. The wind raised by his body blew up his dark red cloak, revealing the profile of a middle-aged man. A crisp sound rang out from the scabbard, and a light blue blade reflected the dim moonlight, slicing through the stagnant air, silently slashing towards the front. That was a plain straight sword. He was half crouching, his eyes fixed on the monster less than a meter away, and his right hand gripped the hilt of the sword on his back. Swoosh! The monster, as large as a brown bear, was forced back several steps by him. Lin Xia couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had fought this monster and knew how terrifying its strength was, but this man in front of him could force it back. The blade of the straight sword traced a crescent moon, clashing with the monster's claws and sparking a series of sparks. Zhao Kongqing growled, his muscles tensed, and he suddenly stepped forward half a step. The monster screamed, glaring at Zhao Kongqing's eyes with resentment. Its long, spear-like forelimbs lifted, trying to kill the detestable human in front of it. However, 2 flashes of the sword, and its forelimbs were cut off. Who is he? After forcing the monster back several steps, Zhao Kongqing moved in a unique way, sticking to the front of the monster like a maggot attached to bone, and his straight sword slashed continuously, leaving a series of ghastly cuts on the monster's body. It rolled to the ground. Crack! Before the monster could scream, a cold light flashed in Zhao Kongqing's eyes, and he swung his straight sword at the monster's neck like lightning. The light blue blade effortlessly cut through the monster's flesh, and the next moment, the monster's head was thrown high into the air. The 2 escaped ghost-faced men have been eliminated. Let the logistics team come and clean up the battlefield. After speaking, he put away the walkie-talkie and walked straight to Lin Xia, who had just managed to extricate himself. The straight sword returned to its sheath, and the dark red cloak was covered in the monster's blood. But because the color was so similar to the cloak, it was not noticeable unless one looked closely. Zhao Kongqing didn't even glance at the monster's corpse on the ground, took out a cigarette from his pocket with leisure, lit it and took a deep puff, then took out the walkie-talkie. After a long while, Zhao Kongqing couldn't help but speak first. Was I cool just now? Lin Xia just stared at him, and he just stared back at Lin Xia. Under the night sky, beside the pool of blood, the 2 men silently stared at each other. Good, it's enough to be cool. Zhao Kongqing chuckled. Do you want to be as cool as me? I don't. Lin Xia stared at his eyes for a moment, found that he was serious, and could only sigh. Cool. Lin Xia's expression was very serious. Zhao Kongqing was somewhat at a loss for words. But you've seen it, you have supernatural powers that ordinary people dream of. Don't you want to be a superhero like in the movies? Zhao Kongqing's mouth twitched slightly. Why? It's easy to die. Right. Zhao Kongqing rubbed his eye corners. The boy in front of him seemed not easy to deal with, but unfortunately, he was involved in this mess, and unfortunately, he had such strong power. Don't you want to? Because it's easy to die. Go ahead, go ahead. Zhao Kongqing waved his hand helplessly, sat down on the roadside, feeling a bit depressed. If it were an ordinary person, they would have been scared out of their wits by now, but this kid is actually thinking about getting his study materials. Let's do this. This is not a place to talk. Let's change a place, and we can have a good chat. Zhao Kongqing thought for a while and said, by the way, my name is Zhao Kongqing, I'm not a bad guy. Lin Xia blinked, obediently nodded, I trust you, you wait here for me, I'll go get my backpack, my study materials are still in it. When I was training with the captain, I never fought so hard. Speaking of which, I don't know how the captain is doing. The Ghostface King is not easy to deal with. The most important thing is, he actually refused me directly. Damn it, I've used all my skills. Those few cuts just now, don't be too cool. Something seems wrong. Zhao Kongqing sat on the roadside without any image, smoking a cigarette in a dazed eye. Any daze. Zhao Kongqing stood still for a dozen seconds, his mouth wide open, unable to believe what he had just experienced. Damn, did this kid run away? Zhao Kongqing suddenly came to his senses, reacted for half a second, then stood up abruptly, quickly looking around. Where is the kid's figure? Yang Jin looked at the tired Lin Xia and asked in confusion, where's your guide cane? Lin Xia changed into slippers, squeezing out a smile on his face. I ran into some trouble on the way, and accidentally lost it. Bro, why are you coming back so late today? Yes, it's solved. Xiao Hailai ran over from the balcony panting, rubbing his head against Lin Xia's leg, then fell to the ground and showed his belly. To avoid Yang Jin seeing the scar on his temple, Lin Xia wrapped the half-length black satin back around his head. But the guide cane was indeed broken. Instead of bringing it back and making his family worried, he chose to throw it away. Nothing, if you lose it, you can change it. Is everything alright? Good, homework done. Still a little bit left. Lin Chiyu squatted down helplessly, rubbing its belly with his hand and asked, Auntie hasn't come back yet? Mom is on the night shift tonight, she won't be back until tomorrow morning. Lin Chiyu nodded, I'm a bit tired, I'll go to sleep first, you go to bed early when you're done. Okay. Hasn't given so much homework in junior high school, it's perverted. Lin Chiyu stood up, complained, and said to Yang Jin, it's okay, if you're tired, don't write it. If the teacher scolds you, tell me, I'll argue with him. The corners of Yang Jin's mouth rose, and he nodded, I'll be done soon. It's okay, go to bed early. Oh, and, the milk is in the fridge, heat it up yourself if you get up early tomorrow. Got it, bro. Lin Chiyu dragged his tired body into his room, about to close the door, and Yang Jin's voice came again. Bro, are you sure you're okay? The door closed gently, and Yang Jin, holding Xiao Hailai, stood outside the room, silently watching Lin Chiyu's room. Yang Jin gently stroked Xiao Hailai's head, you felt it too? Good night. Good night. Woof. He looked up at the dim moonlight outside the window and murmured, smells of blood.